What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so before I get into this video, I want to give a big shout out to the brother Aram for showing love with yet another donation. Salute to you, brother, for showing love to the channel. All right, so I want to talk about in this video the great NBA rivalries, something that is sorely lacking in today's NBA. In recent years, you think about, I think the last really good one was Golden State versus Cleveland. Although you could argue it was a little bit lopsided. Um, then of course, you had a small resurgence of the Celtics and Lakers in the late 2000s. Bulls versus Knicks, Knicks versus Heat. Of course, Lakers versus Celtics in the 1980s. Um, of course, in the 60s, it was more individualized with Wilt versus Russell. But I think the most intense and the most uh, spirited rivalry that we've had in the NBA was one that people don't remember. And that was the early 80s rivalry, late 70s, early 80s rivalry between the Boston Celtics and the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, of course, the most well-known one is, of course, Lakers versus Celtics, and that was because of the Bird Magic dynamic, uh, contrasting playing styles, different cultures, team personalities, different. But with Celtics versus Sixers, you had a rivalry in the same conference. Two great players, Julius Erving, Larry Bird. Larry Bird was up and coming. Julius Erving was the established star, and people forget in 1981 he was the reigning league MVP. Um, the Sixers at that time were seen as the premier team in the Eastern Conference. By 1981, they had been to the Eastern Conference Finals, I believe, three times, I think it was, by that point in time. Let me think about that. 1977. Yeah, three times in the Eastern Conference Finals, although they had not won the ultimate prize, which was a championship. Larry Bird was this up and coming guy from Indiana. Went to Indiana State. Um, Great collegiate star. Lost in I think was still the highest rated college basketball game of all time when he lost to Magic Johnson in 1979, I believe it was that championship game. But he led what was at that time the greatest turnaround in NBA history. He led the Celtics from 29 victories the year before to a whopping 61 victories in 1979, 1980. And this is before the arrival of Kevin McHale. This is before they had the trade or pushed the trade that led to them getting Robert Parrish. That was mostly Larry Bird. And he led them all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals, where they lost to the Philadelphia 76ers. Both these teams also had had a blue collar, tough, gritty culture about them. You know about Philly. Philly's a tough city, you know what I'm saying? Blue collar. Boston's, even though Boston has its Brahmin crowd, they have their nouveau riche or upper crust, old money uh, aspect. But at the foundation with Boston, you have the blue collar crowd. So they were a tough group, and the teams personified or took on the traits, I should say, of their cities, their respective cities. And these two guys hated each other. These two teams hated each other. This was in the culture. And let's not sugarcoat over this too. To a certain extent, there was a slight racial aspect to it, a little bit. Okay, Larry Bird was the up and coming white guy, um, great player. Julius Erving was he never was a guy that took on any of that pro black stuff. But I mean, at the surface, it was there a little bit. I think it was not as emphasized, say, as it was with Magic and Larry, but it was there a little bit. So, 1981, these two teams meet in the Eastern Conference Finals. And this is one hell of a series. Essentially, this series was seen as a championship round. And the reason why that's the case is as the series progresses, it becomes apparent that the Western Conference standard bearer for the finals will be the Houston Rockets. All praise to Moses Malone, who eventually himself would be a Philadelphia 76er. But that Rockets team was like 40-42. He did a hell of a job carrying that team on his back. But let's not forget the Western Conference Finals that year was between two 40-win teams. The Rockets and I think they were then were they the Kansas City Kings or I can't remember whether it was Sacramento or not. Let's go with Sacramento. I can't remember whether it was Kansas City by that point or Sacramento. But anyway, the Rockets and the Kings were in the West Conference Finals. So it was pretty much a given that Boston or Philly were going to win the championship. Because they would have beaten either one of these teams. These two great teams would have beaten that Rockets team. Let's look at these two teams for a second. Let's look at the Philadelphia 76ers because they were absolutely stacked. Of course, you had a reigning MVP in Julius Erving, all right? You had up-and-coming young star Andrew Toney, who I still contend, and anybody that watched him or studied him, if it was not for the foot injury, which he began suffering just like 4 or 5 years into his NBA career, this guy would have been a first ballot Hall of Famer. Andrew Toney was the reason that the Celtics eventually acquired Dennis Johnson because they needed some guy that could at the very least slow down Andrew Toney. It's the reason why he was called the Boston Strangler. Now, he hadn't really come into his own quite yet by 1981, but he was already starting to develop that reputation for being the Boston Celtic killer. Then, of course, you had Daryl Dawkins, who was like a miniature Shaq of his era. You know, he didn't put it all together like Shaq, but, you know, he definitely was a guy like Shaq, super strong, probably one of the 10 strongest players in NBA history. The guy that he was one of the guys that helped popularize the dunk. You had the great Bobby Jones, defensive stalwart on that team, very unselfish. Lionel Hollins, a serviceable guard on that team. Caldwell Jones, Maurice Cheeks, of course. Maurice Cheeks, of course, would go on to have a Hall of Fame career. For a while, he was the all-time leader in steals, 2,310. Earl Cureton, and they had Billy Cunningham, former great NBA player and Sixer himself, as their head coach. Then, of course, the Boston Celtics, up and coming, great team. Boston, led by the great Larry Bird. I said the late, Jesus, I didn't even say that. Led by the great Larry Bird. Also had Tony Archibald, of course. About 8 or 9 years before this, Tony Archibald was an absolute beast, a superstar. 1972-73, averaging 34 points, 11 assists for the Kings. Time the Kansas City Omaha Kings. But at this point in time, Nate Archibald was not the same guy, but he was still a player capable of playing at an all-star level. Cedric Cornbury Maxwell, who incidentally would go on to become the 1981 NBA Finals MVP. And he's the only Finals MVP, if I'm not mistaken, not to make it into the Hall of Fame, although I suspect that might be the case with Andre Iguodala. We have to see. Robert Parrish, his first year with the Boston Celtics. Kevin McHale, his first year with the Boston Celtics. You had Chris Ford, who will be a future coach of the Celtics himself. ML Carr, the very popular ML Carr, who himself would become I think a general manager and a coach put the Celtics in the 90s. Gerald Henderson. I mean, it was great teams, man. Um, what's so unique about this series was the absolute physical play in this series. This is a totally different era. Um, another thing that's interesting about this series is that both these teams in that 7 game series combined for just 18 3-point field goals. And 14 of those attempts, I believe, came with the Boston Celtics. The Sixers only attempted 4 3-pointers in this series. Totally different era of basketball. The 3-point shot was totally eschewed in this era. Completely seen as just a novice shot, a novelty, I should say. Um, what's so interesting about this series, too, is this is the only series in the history of the NBA where 5 games were decided by 2 points or less. If I remember correctly, Game 5 was decided by 2 points. I think Game 6 was decided by 2 points. Game 7 was decided by a point. This was must-see TV. This was these games were slobber knockers. And what's so interesting about this series is, too, if I remember correctly, this was just the second time, I think, in the history of the NBA, this the second time that a team came back from a 3-1 deficit to win, if I'm not mistaken. It was just the second time after the 19, I believe it was the 19, I think it was 1968 Celtics, I think they did it. One of those Russell teams, I think it was 1968 Celtics, came back from a 3-1 deficit. And I think it was against the Philadelphia 76ers. Although I do believe, if I remember correctly, I think they were aided by injuries to the Sixers, but it is what it is. Um, so the odds were against Boston coming back in this series. Um, down 3-1, it just had never really occurred. Matter of fact, I think even force a seventh game, it almost never occurred. Back then, a 3-1 deficit was, it still is to this day, it's still a almost insurmountable lead. But back then, it was almost impossible to come back from a 3-1 deficit, even to force a seventh game. And of course, Game 5 was played at Boston, and Boston was able to win that game, cutting the deficit 3-2. But then most people assumed that going back into Philly, this game would be a wrap. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the Philadelphia 76ers did build a sizable lead. I think at one point in time in Game 6, I think they had something like a 15 or 17 point lead, which back in those days, without the aid of a 3-point shot, that was a pretty big lead. Usually, if a team was up by almost 20 points, the game was over. But the Celtics mounted a furious comeback led by Larry Bird, and they were able to come back. Matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, at one point in this series, there was a brouhaha that almost broke out between a couple of mouths at the Palace between Cedric Cornbread Maxwell and a fan. I think a fan said something inappropriate to Cedric Maxwell. I'll just leave it at that. He exploded in anger. And I think at one point in time, the what do you call it? The voice announcer, whatever you want to call it, the announcer was actually talking about how championship tickets for the Sixers would be going on sale or be available at some time after the game, because they just assumed that the Sixers were going to win, and that actually gave Boston extra motivation, and they came back and won the game by 2 points. I think they won it by, I think Andrew Toney attempted to tie the game. I think he drove to the basket trying to I think he tried to score. I think it was Kevin McHale that blocked the shot that led to them icing the game and they were tied 3-3 going back to Boston. Because I'm not mistaken, I think Boston had home court advantage in this series. Game 7 at Boston. And this is one of the great games in the history of the NBA. One of the most physical games in the history of the NBA. Matter of fact, I remember, what's his name? I can't think of his name right now, man. The super fan, the Celtics super fan. I can't think of his name right now, but he said something like to the effect that if this game was played today, there'd have been 20 flagrant fouls called. He was saying that to Dr. J in an interview. But ultimately, the Boston Celtics won Game 7 at Boston, 91-90. And they did something that only a few teams in the history of the NBA have been able to do, is come back and win a series down 3-1. I think it was the 1968 Boston Celtics that did that, the 81 Celtics, the 95 Rockets did it against the Phoenix Suns. We all remember that series. And of course, LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers come back from a 3-1 deficit against the Golden State Warriors. Although I have to say, in my opinion, I put asterisks a little bit on the 68 Celtics and the 2016 Cavaliers, because if I'm not mistaken, I think Boston benefited a lot from injuries to the Sixers. And I think that, of course, Cleveland benefited from a suspension to Draymond Green and, of course, injury to Andrew Bogut. So to come back against a fully healthy, no injuries, no nothing. Give full credit to Kim Olajuwon and the Rockets in 95 and Larry Bird and the Boston Celtics in 81. It came out from a 3-1 deficit. And now, of course, ultimately, the Boston Celtics won the championship in that finals round against the Houston Rockets. So, in this playoff series, Larry Bird had a monster series. He averaged in 45 minutes of play per game. So this guy was an absolute workhorse that series. He averaged 26.7 points, 13.4 rebounds, 4.6 assists, 1.9 steals, 1.4 blocks. He shot 49% from the floor and 89% from the free throw line. Nate Tiny Archibald averaged 19 points, 7.4 assists, and 1 steal. He shot about 44% from the floor, 79% from the line. Cedric Cornbread Maxwell, 15.6 points, 6.4 rebounds, 1 steal, 1 block, 58% shooting from the floor, 84% from the foul line. Robert Parrish, 13.9 points, 9.1 rebounds, 1.1 steals, 2.3 blocks. Didn't shoot the ball particularly well at 43%. And Kevin McHale, because we all remember he came off the bench the first few years, behind Cornbread Maxwell, 9 points on 57% shooting from the floor. Dr. J did not have the best series by his standards, not his lofty standards. He averaged 19.9 points, 5.9 rebounds, 4.1 assists, 1.3 steals, 2.4 blocks. Only shot 43% from the floor, which is below his norm of about 48 to 52%. Andrew Toney, 19.1 points, 3 assists, 1 steal, shot 46% from the floor, hit the only three-pointer for the Philadelphia 76ers in the series. And Darryl Dawkins had a pretty good series, 15.4 points, 6.6 rebounds. And therefore, Bobby Jones, almost 15 points a game. Great series, man. Down to the wire. If you haven't watched this series, if you're a fan of old school basketball, you may want to watch this series. One of the great NBA series, one of the great series in sports history, period. And many people consider this the greatest series in the history of the NBA. And salute to two legends slugging it out back in the golden era of the league. What you guys think?